Hi, I'm Chris with Sanderson Test Prep, and in this video I'm going to give you a few tips for one of the most effective ways to memorize unit circle. So a lot of times when you're taking pre-calc, a teacher will give you a worksheet that looks something like this, and we see what seems to be a widely variable array of numbers with positives and negatives. Some of them are whole numbers, some of them are roots, and at first glance, it can be a little bit difficult to make sense out of. But here's a really great way to memorize unit circle. And we should always start when memorizing unit circle with this first quadrant. So for right now, we're not going to worry about any of these other quadrants, any of the other angle values or coordinates outside of this first quadrant right here. So if we focus in on this first quadrant, I'm going to put a chart together for you and talk about an easy way to memorize the corresponding coordinates for each degree value that you have in that first quadrant without having to memorize them as just individual points, but with a pattern in place. So between sine and cosine, your cosine values are going to correspond to your x coordinates, and your sine values are going to correspond to your y coordinates. But even though that's the case, I actually recommend starting with your sine values because those are going to count up. Your sine values, if we look at each of these y's, we go from 0 to 1/2 root 2 over 2, root 3 over 2, and all the way up to 1. So as your angles count up, your sine values also count up. So it's an easy starting point. But here's something that I'm going to have you do, because if we write out the values that we see there, and we write out 0 and then 1/2 and then root 2 over 2, root 3 over 2, and then 1 as our last value. So that looks very disjointed. Again, like we said, a couple whole numbers in there, we have a fraction, we have some roots. So they all look like they don't really follow much of a visible pattern. So let's see if we can change that up a tiny bit. So we're gonna try something a little bit different. What I want you to write is a square root sign. We're going to fill in the square roots together in just a second, but you're going to write a square root sign and then leave some space to put in a number there. And you're going to put the square root value over 2 for each of these coordinate points for your sign. So we're just setting up a little framework here. And the reason that we're setting up this framework is because I want to show you that the numbers that go in the square roots, if you count with those numbers in perfect order, so if you put in a square root of 0, square root of 1, square root of 2, square root of 3, and square root of 4. So as your angles count up in increasing order, your sine values are going to count up very similarly, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the advantage of looking at it as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is let's take a look at what these values look like when we reduce them. It'll look just like the coordinates that we see here in our filled in unit circle. The square root of 0 is in fact 0, and divided by 2. 0 divided by 2 will give us 0. So the sine coordinate here, just like we see in the filled in circle, is a 0. When we take the square root of 1, that's just a 1 over 2, so that'll be a 1/2. We don't have a perfect root of root 2, so we just leave that as root 2 over 2, and same thing with root 3 over 2. And then the square root of 4 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we do get these corresponding coordinate values once we reduce, but it's a lot easier for us to remember this basic framework and just remember 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, counting up in that order, and we can reduce to find any value if we should forget one. You can always figure it out using this method. And then for cosine, guess what? That same framework is going to work for us here, where we've got the square roots over 2 for each. But your cosine values, as you can tell looking at the filled in unit circle, your cosine values count down from 90 degrees down to the 0. So 0 is your maximum cosine value, and then at 90 we have our minimum cosine value. So if we take a look at those, it's going to be, oops, let me change that color. It's going to be the same process that we did for sine, except we're just going to switch this around a tiny little bit. Instead of going in that direction, we're going to go in this direction. So here you would count down. Your maximum value is up here, and you have 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, which again reduces to all of those coordinate points that we are familiar with in our filled in unit circle. So whether you're solving for sine or cosine of any particular angle, when you're trying to memorize unit circle, step one is to take a look at this first quadrant, create this chart so that we can always figure out sine and cosine values for any point within that first quadrant very readily. And if you understand where those values come from and how to find them, then it doesn't have to be as much raw memorization. It's actually something that you can figure out for any missing value. If you want to take a look at how we can figure out the corresponding values in the other quadrants, or when you're dealing with radian measures, then please check out our other videos, and thanks for watching.